You saw this definition that we're using that comes out of the white paper on Quadrant D leadership to remind us that leadership is really about what goes on in the organization and the degree of empowerment within that organization and whether that organization is truly focused on the needs of students and the future preparation of those students. As we tried to make some connections between what we know about teaching and learning and how we improve that with that model, it really informs some of the aspects about leadership as well. Because just like in instruction, there are basic things that need to be taught. Vocabulary words to learn, writing rules of grammar, and so forth. We really aspire to a higher level of learning. Same way in leadership. There are some basic elements that need to be there for safety and security and the efficient operation of the school building, but that's not sufficient to really sustain the kind of instructional improvements that we're after. We recognize that the rigor and relevant framework very subtly shifts the conversation from teaching to learning. If you sit with a group of teachers and ask them to describe the level of rigor and relevance of what they're teaching, they move the instruction away from their lesson plan to the work that the students are doing and whether it exhibits the characteristics of high rigor or high relevance. That's a very subtle but powerful shift in getting them to think differently about what goes on in the classroom, what the student is doing versus what they're doing. I think the Quadrant D leadership framework can do exactly the same kind of thing, getting the organization to think about their contribution to overall leadership and not just about what he or she does as the leader in that school. And then finally, we've seen how powerful simple mental models can be. When we started with the rigor relevant framework, we never had any idea it would be as successful and influential as it has been in instruction around the country. And we think the same kind of framework in talking about leadership can do exactly the same thing. In the whole complex area of leadership and how we deal with those within schools. So we've taken the same 4 quadrants, A, B, C, D, framed those with knowledge and application that Ray talked about, and using knowledge up the vertical axis and application across the horizontal axis, and saying these are dimensions of leadership. Leadership groups that I've worked with, and a way to introduce this, I ask them to describe what they envision good quality leadership is. And we come up with a lot of different examples. In having high success of student learning, meeting all of student needs, having some autonomy within a school that teachers feel the ability to take some risks and do some things different. You put together a brainstorm list like that, it's pretty easy to sort that list into these 2 variables. It has to do with vision and it has to do with empowerment. And you can use this framework to say it really describes 2 directions of how we're trying to improve leadership within an organization. Now, we can talk about levels in that and draw the 4 quadrants of high and low and look at how we can move vertically with embracing a better vision, higher levels of knowledge, higher expectations for students. And we've seen, and Ray mentioned, these kinds of practices of the kinds of things that we can do to move vertically, from low on our knowledge to high on our knowledge. The way that we powerfully use data, what data we use to describe student achievement, and how we move that to a higher level. Moving horizontally is about increasing the distribution and density of leadership. That it's not just about the people in the formal leadership positions, but it's about how the entire organization represents that. Staff taking initiative, working in leadership teams, and those teams empowered to solve problems and to contribute to improving instruction. But we shouldn't forget the students, and we've seen a lot of examples doing a session later on specifically about student leadership and how valuable that can be to taking the leadership within an organization to an even higher level. These are the practices that Ray talked about. All we know about good team building in the way that you begin to move that organization as an empowered organization rather than a top-down kind authoritarian structure. Label the 4 quadrants in this manner, that gives us another descriptor of what these 4 quadrants are rather than the shortcut of quadrant A, B, C, and D. But the schools that have begun to work with this find that a convenient shortcut in saying, Dick, you're spending a little bit too much time as a quadrant A leader and ways that you might operate a little bit differently to move into a different quadrant. That shortcut or label has a very meaningful conversation among everyone within the school community and how they begin to move forward. So that's our aspiration, to try and move toward that adaptive leadership in Quadrant D. But as Ray talked about today, it isn't about saying we need to get rid of Quadrant A leadership that's bad and Quadrant D leadership is good. Good leadership needs to function in all 4 quadrants. And depending upon the situation, you may need to kickstart an organization with becoming more authoritarian. And there are certain issues that Ray talked about as examples today where it's absolutely essential to be more authoritarian. And it's that blending or balance of those quadrants that really makes a difference within schools. But all the time trying to reflect on our practice and saying, we took that action, but was there an opportunity to raise the level of rigor and relevance of what we're doing? As we begin to think about the instructional piece, that you can identify where your organization is with some of these characteristics of the kinds of adjectives or characteristics that would describe the organization. So I'd ask you to think about that. When you see a Quadrant A organization that really is dominant in that kind of quadrant, and I've been in schools where that was the dominant environment. Staff are very compliant. There's a tremendous tendency to protect my turf and maintain what I have. People put up some walls in regard to that. And then finally, they're very reactive. There isn't a lot of anticipation of problems. When things occur, we know how to solve those, and generally it's passing it to a higher level of authority. In Quadrant C, where you've got higher knowledge, staff become more independent. Now, they still may be that turf protective because there isn't that empowered organization, but staff become a little bit more proactive because they set some goals about what they want to work toward in those high expectations. In Quadrant B, now we've moved to high empowerment. Here, staff are much more interdependent rather than independent, working and depending upon one another and working collaboratively, much more open and sharing practices. I see some of those differences in schools that we work with. And then finally, you're still a little bit reactive. There isn't the kinds of anticipation and proactivity that we might see in Quadrant C. So if we combine the best of Quadrant C and B, we'd see those in the Quadrant D organization that has that kind of leadership. Great initiative in staff, taking risks and trying new things, and you have this open, sharing, collaborative environment, but also proactive in what they're trying to do as an organization. Ray used this one sports metaphor as an example as well, in thinking about the role that the individual leader might play in each of those organizations and thinking about that different style. Wanted to share just a little bit of my take on the Quadrant D leadership, and let me move that now to begin to talk about how we can apply that to instructional leadership. One of the things that we've recognized that in preparing leaders, if you understand the mental models, that's a key ingredient in how you look at your responsibility. But also you need to have the skills and ability that go along with that. And Ray touched on a number of those. The kinds of personal skills, the social emotional skills are so critical to being an effective leader that you couple that with the mental models that you really can move to that level of effective leadership within an organization. And the third element is tools and processes. The kinds of resources and tools and the way that we analyze data, the ways that we look at instruction, that becomes the third part of this equation in really making a difference. So we've been using this to think about how we can respond as an organization and the questions that we asked you this morning.